Welcome to a deep dive, everyone, into the world of microfinance. And wow, you really went deep with this reading list. Articles, excerpts, research papers. Someone's serious about getting past those feel-good headlines about small loans, huh?
It's quite a journey, isn't it? And you're right, those feel-good narratives were everywhere, especially back in the late 20th century.
Yeah, like that whole give a man a fish, teach a man to fish, but with loans.
Right, except it was more like empower a woman, empower a family, because remember, the focus was often on women borrowers.
Which, I mean, it makes sense on the surface, right? Helping women build businesses, support their families.
Exactly. It was seen as this elegant solution, especially in the 70s and 80s when those huge top-down development projects were failing left and right. Microfinance was supposed to be the alternative, more personal, more empowering.
So where did it all go wrong?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's not so much about things going wrong, but more like, well, imagine this. You have these experts swooping in with their ideas about lending and development, right? But they often overlooked the systems that were already working on the ground.
Hold on, are you talking about those SUSUs? Those rotating savings and credit associations?
Exactly. These community-based systems were already deeply ingrained in many cultures, including Sierra Leone, which you specifically asked about.
Wow, so it's like, we're here to help. But the help wasn't always wanted or needed.
It's a classic example of good intentions maybe not having the intended outcomes. And it gets even more complicated when you factor in the push for microfinance to become commercially viable, which happened big time in the late 90s.
Right, with that whole microcredit summit in '97. Talk about ambitious goals. They wanted to reach 100 million borrowers.
Exactly. Suddenly, everyone was throwing money at microfinance, private investors, you name it, which on the one hand meant more resources, but on the other hand,
it became more about profits than people.
it's a tricky balance, and that's where those cautionary tales come in, like what happened with Kardas-Nelson in Mexico, or even more dramatically in Andhra Pradesh, India.
Okay, now those are stories I want to hear more about.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about real people, real lives, impacted by this shift from idealism to industry. It's almost like the more we dig into this, the more complicated it gets.
And that's the thing about trying to understand complex systems, right? There are always layers.
Yeah, because on the one hand, you have this incredibly appealing idea, small loans, empowering people to lift themselves out of poverty. But then
You start seeing how those loans can become a burden, especially when the focus shifts from social impact to
profit.
Exactly. And like we were talking about, Comfort Thomas is a perfect example of that. They started with this really noble goal of reaching poor borrowers in Mexico. But,
When they went public, things took a turn.
well, yeah, because suddenly they're accountable to shareholders, right?
Okay.
People who are primarily interested in seeing their investments grow.
Which, don't get me wrong, I get it. Investing is important and all. But when it comes at the expense of vulnerable borrowers,
It raises some serious ethical questions. And it brings us back to those cautionary tales, like what happened in Andhra Pradesh. Remember we were talking about that?
yeah, the suicides. That's just, I mean,
It's tragic, and while microloans weren't the sole cause, they definitely played a role in creating this perfect storm of debt and desperation.
so where do we go from here? If microloans aren't the answer, what is?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that a lot of researchers and policymakers are grappling with. There's a growing movement to explore alternative approaches.
Alternatives like?
Well, one that's gaining traction is the idea of direct cash transfers, basically just giving people money with no strings attached.
Wait, really? Like, just handing out cash? That seems risky, doesn't it? What if people just blow it on?
I know, it sounds counterintuitive, right? But there's actually a lot of research that suggests otherwise. Studies have shown that when people receive unconditional cash transfers, they tend to spend the money on essential needs like food, education, healthcare.
So instead of assuming people need to be told how to spend money, we trust them to make the best choices for themselves and their families.
Exactly. And when you give people that agency, that control over their own lives, it can be incredibly empowering. Plus, it cuts out all the bureaucracy and overhead that often comes with traditional aid programs.
You're blowing my mind here a little. So, are you saying that just giving people money might actually be more effective than these complicated loan programs?
It's a radical idea, I'll grant you that. But the evidence is starting to suggest that it might just work.
Okay, cash transfers, that's fascinating. But we also have to talk about what might be the most radical idea of all universal basic income.
Yes, basic income. The idea that everyone, regardless of income or employment, should receive a regular payment from the government.
I've heard of it, obviously. It always seemed like, I don't know, kind of a pie-in-the-sky idea. But you're making me think maybe it's not so crazy after all.
Well, it's definitely an idea that's gaining more attention. And there have actually been some promising pilot programs in places like Finland and Canada.
Really? I had no idea. So what did they find? Did it work?
It's still early days, and more research is needed, but the preliminary results suggest that basic income can have a positive impact on things like poverty reduction, health outcomes, even entrepreneurship.
Okay, so potentially huge benefits. But I imagine there are downsides as well, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
Critics argue that it would be too expensive, that it would discourage people from working.
That whole why work if you don't have to argument.
Right. But proponents of basic income say that it's about more than just money. It's about creating a safety net for everyone, ensuring that everyone has the means to live a dignified life, regardless of their employment status.
This is making me think about that quote, "A rising tide lifts all boats." If everyone has a basic level of security, wouldn't that benefit society as a whole?
That's the idea behind it. Now, whether it's politically feasible or economically viable on a large scale, that's a whole other conversation. But as a thought experiment, it's definitely worth exploring.
Okay, so we've got cash transfers, we've got basic income. It seems like there's a whole world of alternative economic models out there just waiting to be explored.
And that's what I find so exciting about this whole deep dive, right? It's not just about poking holes in the existing system. It's about opening ourselves up to new possibilities, new ways of thinking about poverty, development, and even the very nature of work itself.
It's a lot to process, but in a good way. Like, it's making me question everything.
And that's a good thing, right? Because when we stop questioning, when we stop being curious, that's when we stop growing.
True that. Okay, so where do we go from here? What are the next steps on this journey of exploration?
Well, I think the first step is to acknowledge that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. What works in one context might not work in another. And so it's crucial to approach these issues with a sense of humility, a willingness to learn from different experiences.
So no more swooping in with prepackaged solutions thinking we know what's best for everyone else.
Exactly. It's about listening to the people on the ground, understanding their needs, their aspirations. It's about working collaboratively to create solutions that are tailored to specific contexts.
So it's about shifting the power dynamic, moving away from this top-down approach to development and towards something that's more equitable, more participatory.
Absolutely. And that requires us to be willing to challenge our own assumptions, to step outside of our comfort zones. Because real change, lasting change, often comes from unexpected places.
Okay, I'm ready for some unexpected. Let's do it.
All right, then buckle up, because this is where things get really interesting.
I'm still thinking about those women in Sierra Leone,
Their stories are powerful.
Trying to make ends meet, dealing with loans, and just, I don't know, it makes you wonder, what if they didn't have to worry about debt? What if their basic needs were just met?
It's a huge question, right? It shifts the whole conversation from how do we fix individuals to how do we fix the system that's keeping people trapped?
System change.
Yeah.
That feels big though, doesn't it? Like, where do you even start?
Well, it starts with values, doesn't it? What do we as a society prioritize? Right now, it's all about economic growth. But what if we focused on well-being instead?
Instead of GDP, it's like access to healthcare, education, even just happiness, right? Those become the metrics.
Exactly. We measure what matters. Because honestly, the cost of inequality, of all those unmet needs, it's astronomical. Crime, poverty, environmental damage, it all adds up.
So investing in people isn't just the nice thing to do, it's the smart thing.
Exactly. But, okay, how do we get there? We've talked about cash transfers, basic income.
Which are huge, don't get me wrong. But they're still mostly about fixing the problem after it already exists.
Right, so we need to look upstream too. Things like affordable housing, quality education, those have to be part of the equation. They're not privileges, they're fundamental, right?
And while we're at it, what about those more, radical economic models we skimmed over? Like, instead of just redistributing wealth, what about changing how it's created in the first place?
Cooperatives, community ownership models, there are so many possibilities out there.
It's like those OSUS again, right?
Yeah.
Proof that people can create systems of support from within communities, no outside experts required.
And that's something to remember, right? The answers aren't always going to come from top-down solutions. Often, the best ideas come from the people closest to the challenges themselves.
So it's about listening more than we lecture.
Yeah.
And being willing to admit we don't have all the answers.
100%. This whole deep dive, it's been about questioning, exploring alternatives. It can feel overwhelming, but to me, it's also incredibly hopeful.
Because it reminds us we have agency. We can choose a different path.
And that's what I hope listeners take away from this. We might not have all the solutions, but by engaging in these conversations, by being curious, by being willing to imagine something different, we can create real change.
Absolutely. So, to everyone listening, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.